שלום לכם, אחר צהריים טובים. אנחנו חוזרים מהפסקת הצהריים לדיון שלפחות
for a discussion which, at least in my view, is one of the most interesting and important ones. And there is a whole line of participants which is going to make it even better. The title is Israel as a democratic state of law. Is this the end of an era? And I'm very happy to invite onto the podium of Herzliya Conference 2019 Professor Daniel Friedmann, formerly Minister of Legal Affairs, Dr. Avigdor, Dori, Klagsbald, an attorney, Revital, Swid, formerly member of Knesset, an attorney, and Meni, Yitshaki from the Police Investigation and Intelligence Department. Okay, I hope that everyone's ready to go. You're all mic'd up. We put our phones on silent mode, some water perhaps, and let's begin. So, the headline here, Israel as a democratic state of law. Is this an end of an era? And some would say that in Israel, nostalgia is a really serious illness. People always miss the past. Some say that we are at the point of historical low of our state of Israel as a state of law, and democracy is under danger, or the entire legal system is at an existential threat. Dr. Avichai Mandelblit said over this very stage that this is under an attack or under a threat. And I'd like to open with a question for all of you. Professor Friedmann, you will be the first one to respond. Is this so, in your opinion? Are we at the lowest point ever for the state of Israel? Of course, speaking from these angles that we are mentioning. I don't think this is the way. We had many low points. I can mention the stinky stint that happened in the parliament, or in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and they knew how to respond and to amend the law properly. We had many crises, and there are crises, and I'd like to say the following. Holding up democracy entails, or a democratic rule entails, a whole line of conditions. I'm not going to detail them all, but it requires self-containment for the power holders and the ability to accept losing the reins, so to speak. We see in that respect a challenge for some time now. One challenge, by the way, comes from the Supreme Court. The restraint that we used to characterize it for the first, let's say, 40 years have long gone. And I can give you one example for what had happened. There was an evacuation of half the island of Sinai. Was there any petition to the Court of Appeals? Nobody even thought that this is a matter for the court. And several years go by, and all of a sudden there is another one at the Gaza Strip. And all of a sudden 11 judges sit and write 300 pages, and one thinks that he can completely cancel the entire procedure. So we are at a situation where there's a challenge from this respect. And right now we also see a challenge, and I'm saying it is a challenge. It is not toppling of democracy. On the other hand, it's very obvious that the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, or the political system ultimately reacted to the fact that the Supreme Court has entered its premises, and it reacted with the nation-state law. I don't think this is a good or successful reaction, but they have done it. And for the first time recently, we have seen that after elections, there was a decision to go again towards elections. And after this decision was made, the people who decided to go for elections now want to retract their decision, or they're thinking about it. This goes to show that there is lack of self-restraint. There is some sort of problem with functionality, but there were things that occurred previously like that. They were graver. There was a phenomenon at the time with this stinky stint, and there was benefits on the one hand, one political party and then another one. They were more extreme. It happened to be more extreme than what we see today. We see some attempts to get that far. These are attempts where I see some sort of a shaking of democracy or a certain challenge. But I don't think the situation is worse than we had it in the past, or that there is a real danger for democracy. There is a need to handle lack of self-restraint, lack of ability to function, as we have seen just recently at the legislators' parliament. Advocate Klagsbald, is this true? I do agree with many of the things that Danny said. We are at a point of crisis, at a low point. I agree that there is lack of balance between the various authorities, and I agree that this period of time is characterized by lack of self-restraint. However, this lack of self-restraint comes from the executive branch, not the judicial one. What we have seen recently is the strengthening of the executive branch vis-à-vis other authorities. Let's start with an arena that is less discussed, and this is the complete takeover of the government over the parliament. The Israeli parliament lost all of its weight as far as separating the different authorities. It is completely dominated by the government. We can talk about the reasons for that. Some have to do with the way that Israeli parliament members are being elected, the fact that the characteristics and the skills is not excellent parliamentarism, and we see a decline in their skills and lack of independence. We saw several examples of that. For example, there was a cancellation of the attempt to legislate taxation on the third apartment. This law was brought to the parliament close to midnight. It was immediately passed, and then the majority of the parliament members didn't even know what was written in the law. By the way, and some other laws were done in the same manner. Now there is a continued clash between the Supreme Court and the executive authority. Recently we see concrete discussions of about the override clause. Some very harsh expressions, the fact that the skills that they look for in the Minister of Legal Affairs is how he's going to stand up to the Supreme Court, personal legislation, many points of clashing. If you look at what this current Minister of Legal Affairs said in his first interview, unprecedented things. For example, you don't need to follow every ruling of the Supreme Court and such. There is no doubt that the last period of time is characterized by the attempt of the government to override other branches and authorities. Another example, this is the ongoing attempt to try and gain control over the media. We know how there was an attempt to try and take control over the state communication authority, Ta'agid. They tried to take out all the current news affairs and try to neutralize it. Another one is try to overtake private media channels, either by trying to recruit relatives or using financial interest of the stakeholders or the owners of newspapers. Let's add the word allegedly. We talk about Walla, we talk about Yediot Achronot newspaper. You see how the executive branch is gaining momentum, is gaining aggressive power, has no stops vis-a-vis other authorities. Advocate Swid, this is the middle of an election terms and the middle of primaries. We want to thank you. We imagine that you are talking to your voters while we're talking here. And of course, until recently, you have been in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. What do you think about this specific point, July 2019, where we are now in Israeli democracy? Good afternoon to all. It's very nice that you say July 2019, because it seems that each and every month we find ourselves every time again and again at a low point which is deteriorating. And I'd like to say to you that if we will have another year, 2 or 4 years that are similar to the last year we have had in the past Knesset, our democracy is going to be at a point of no return. Our democracy and democracy at large is characterized by several layers. The first one is separating authorities. My friend Dori said it properly. You have to separate between the executive and the legislative authorities, but it's also separating the judicial authority and the legislative authority. And the moment we see attempts of trying to crumple and ruin and try to make sure that the Supreme Court is politicized and delegitimize the Supreme Court, we see one of these levels completely hard. What is the role of those threshold guards, whether it is the court, whether it is the state controller, whether it is other people? They should put checks and balances onto the executive branch, which always wants to take as much as possible. What we see here today is the attempt to try and weaken them. When we see at the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, when he is sworn to his position, when he talks about the fact that when the state controller does not need to intervene, I am shaken, because we see that what this government and the Prime Minister is trying to promote is definitely happening in reality. And the balance or the incorporation between the extreme right-wing people who want to introduce their extreme ideology, and the Prime Minister, or ministers for that matter, who are thinking only about their political survival, and they're marking their targets, whether it is the Israeli police, whether it is trying to put them in prison, to sue them, and all sorts of statements that really shake us up. We know that we are at a harsh situation. And when we look at democracy, it is characterized by the freedom of speech. And when we see persecution of artists and persecution of the media and trying to silence complete populations of the left, of minorities, of LGBTs, anyone who is considered a traitor, now we are in a harsh situation, a very difficult one, and we all must wake up, and we mustn't allow our democracy not only to retract, but we mustn't help it. And what my friend, Professor Friedmann, was trying to do or say for many years, that there is a court that perhaps should be more conservative. You can accept that or not. I disagree in this case, but that's not the point. There's nothing between this and what politicians have taken and what they have done. And we all must wake up.
Commissioner, retired Commissioner Yitshaki, I mean, you keep saying that our situation has never been worse. Well, for me, through the police prism, I mean, you investigated these people after all. I can actually testify to that, basically. I mean, the moment I sort of look up for a moment, a little further, after all, this is the 4th or 5th discussion since this conference started, and we keep speaking about social resilience, and we used to talk about the national security net, and that's it kind of thing. But I think it's very important to relate also to the fact that there is a discussion on it, a discourse. The fact is that people are sitting and listening and people are discussing it. So if we look at everything that is happening around us vis-a-vis the social internal resilience, concerning your question, my impression is that those sort of thresholds on sort of verging on which actually democracy is standing are stable, but we need to really analyze the processes very closely and very deeply. I think that the processes that we ran for the last year or so, we were very pinpointed, very cautious, very fundamentally sort of and thorough with the other systems in order retain the capability of the gatekeepers to carry out what is upon their shoulders, their role and their function. I'm not saying that there are no attacks on left and right. Things are happening, but despite that, I think that things were implemented, were carried out, in my opinion, in a very honest, processed manner. In other words, it was based on process, and that's very important. I think we need to stress the gatekeepers, and it has been mentioned here before, how society is used to looking at things and looks upon these processes. Me personally, it really does interest me how they relate to it in the discourse amongst us. The way the discourse is running, what we say about the processes that are taking place and that we're taking part in. I mean, I have no research study. This is something subjective. But my feeling is that there are more and more people who feel that the right tools should be awarded to the gatekeepers to carry out their duties and to keep that sort of threshold. Not that nothing should go further, that should be stable. Mayor Ohana, in the first interview as a Minister of Justice he gave to the journalist, he said, yes, it's very possible that I will be framed as a Minister of Justice. I was warned by people around me. I'm preparing myself emotionally for it. I'm saying that it might, and mentally, because it might possibly happen. I mean, they're not always completely clean people. Some of those considerations are sort of based on other interests. So who would dare do something like that to the ministers of justice in the state of Israel? Again, I'm coming back into that area that I was located for many a year. I would like to unequivocally say that I did not identify or see in any case that a specific group or more sat down and decided to mark someone and act against a specific person. Maybe he's talking about the Yitshaki document that ostensibly sort of listed all the various offenses. No. I mean, yes, it was leaked out and there are various work papers. And I'm not going to start going into explanations and how one does write such a document. But yes, I think that when you do work in an organized manner, then it is incumbent upon you that the work should be done, that you do have discussions with the Attorney General, with the state prosecutor, because what, you're going to come with premises and tenets and theses, or because I like this person or I don't like this person. In most of the cases, the intention is either to verify or to actually refute. So usually things are refuted. It's maybe initial knowledge. It's not usually, I mean, I don't want to start talking about the techniques of our work and the methods, but you definitely do need to come with info and material. And the moment you see that the intel has brought us stuff that we can refute easily, then you go in a different direction. You walk away from it. Of course, there are people, families, emotions, roles, and appointments behind all this. So you have to take that into consideration. It does not exist the idea that we should actually mark someone and say, this person is who we're going to blow down his neck kind of thing. But I mean, Professor Friedmann you know, sort of, do you believe that someone should actually feel that he's going to have something alleged against him and sort of he's going to be falsely accused of something? No. I don't think that a minister of justice, but for example, it was the Attorney General, he said that yes, targets are being marked out and people are being pointed out. No. I mean, Mazur said it at the time. I think that there are more than one case that happened. You cannot just sort of say, no, this never existed. But on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, they say that they did open various investigations. If you remember, there was one opened up against Reuven Rivlin, who's now the president of Israel, just the eve of his appointment to the Ministry of Justice. I don't want to enumerate all the cases wherein it did happen, and there were a plethora of them. So maybe Minister Ohana is right with what he said. On the other hand of the coin, there is a whole group of people who are protective. There wasn't an actual examination of what happened in the at the sort of the state attorney, Tel Aviv's attorney office. It wasn't actually really investigated. It's very often people just sort of make allegations and they doctor certain things. But we're talking about the executive arm of government, which of course is the actual government. That's the law. But that's not accurate because the executive arm is divided into two in the state of Israel. We're talking about the prosecution and enforcement and police forces are not actually, those specific entities are not subject to the court, to the law. But I sincerely hope that the Prime Minister won't tell me, but he cannot actually, he's the head of the executive arm, but he cannot actually give some kind of injunction against me. But the executive arm is totally independent, and they're not elected after all, but one has to know what the situation is exactly, define it, explain it, and they also have their own vested interests, their own world opinions, and sometimes they are in contradiction to things that are happening. Would you say that if they do things that are not sort of fair or not sort of that are acceptable, then they might start judging and sort of framing him and making allegations against him? I think that we ought not to put blindfolds on, and we have to understand the executive arm in Israel, and that's part of what does happen in Israel, as in contrast to other countries that do control the police, do control the others entities. After all, we have to ensure that things like that don't happen. The British system was the dominating sort of method. Advocate Klagsbald, just 6 weeks ago, you participated in an emergency meeting because you wanted to weaken the whole court system. And you said that just because one person has a problem, we're not going to change and sort of shake up the entire legal system. Of course, your previous client, Benjamin Netanyahu, was the person in question here. I'd just like to pinpoint something specific, if you don't mind bringing your microphone closer. Following what Professor Friedmann said, there are things I don't agree with about things, but the way he worded things, I do agree with. You cannot negate the fact that there were investigations opened up with various irrelevant considerations that I do accept. In other words, Justice Ohana is getting a tailwind to some of his claims. Let's not go overboard. No, but I'm a journalist, so that's what I'm doing. But what I'm saying is very cautiously, I'm not talking about a phenomenon, I'm not talking about something systemic, but Yaakov, Neiman, Ruby Rivlin, Ruby Rivlin, what else? Chaim Ramon would probably add himself. And Professor Friedmann might add him as well. But that is the order of magnitude. So just we're talking about three ministers of justice, Rafael, Eitan, Kahalani. There are other examples, but that's not the typical phenomenon. And also concerning these phenomena, I wouldn't say about all of them, but various ones were connected to something that were not only relevant considerations. I think that there was a terrible risk over the last years that was perceived as something that was relevant, and that is the personal legislation. Other than the formal issues of issues, I mean, what Judge Cheshen said was not done. In other words, various kind of arrests that were typified some of the various authorities in Israel. But now what is actually happening is it's not only personal legislation that should be totally called a total breach actually here. But if you talk about the basic laws, that adds the overriding clause for the sake of it, for the sake of that personal legislation. It's not a law. These are proposals.
Yes, they're bills. If we didn't find ourselves in the middle of a repeat election, they might be more relevant. But even a personal bill is wrong. That's why I say that this motivated me to say the sentence that you quoted earlier, that it's unacceptable to change the basic legislation, which is the constitutional basis, because of problems of an individual. When we see the most influential attorneys in Israel, and they're gathered in a single room, which is not a simple matter, and they're standing on their hind legs, as it were, should we be optimistic about that? Because people are waking up and they're suddenly looking around and saying, we've never seen that before. Yes, there was a sense that a red line had been crossed, especially with the anticipated passage of an immunity law, of a passage of the override clause, the complaints against the Supreme Court, the fact that the Supreme Court has the authority to disqualify laws. Those are... That is not... There was no political consensus among us, just a consensus about those subjects. MK Swid, after we heard about the circumstances of the resignation of the previous chief of the bar, Efi Naveh, in wake of the television program that investigated him, we see that the appointment of judges is not exactly an advertisement for proper governance either. We're talking a lot about trust in the police, trust in the legal system, trust in the Knesset. And when Joe K. Public sits down and looks at these things and say, these are the people who are judging us? First of all, I think that the law today and the makeup of the panel that makes up, that appoints the judges, and I actually was a member of the panel that appoints religious judges, which is similar, is the right makeup to choose judges in Israel. With all due respect to everything the politicians are saying, and with all due respect to what people from the coalition are saying, that we have to have a public hearing for judges or for prospective judges in the Knesset. But with all due respect, there are politicians on the committee. There are 2 ministers and 2 Knesset members, and they as a group are the majority. It is indeed possible that we need to weigh, perhaps if there was a little more transparency. About the transparency, I agree, says MK Swid. I agree about the transparency, yes, and the minutes should be made public. And indeed, we should open up the way the discussions held. But I'd like to take everything that has been said here by all the people here today. When we are in a situation where the legal system, the law enforcement system are being attacked on a regular basis, we can't sit and criticize the Yitshaki document, and it needs to be criticized. We did criticize it in the Knesset, but I find myself in a situation where I have to defend the police, and you can't see, because in these systems there are always things that need to be changed and fixed. The legal system is not free of error. Many of us are lawyers, we're familiar with litigation, and we know that there's a thing or two that needs to be fixed in the legal system. But you can't fix those things that need fixing when the whole system is under attack. Those people don't want to fix it, they want to destroy it. We're talking about the override clause. In another policy, we could hold a legitimate discussion, like over seniority, the seniority method of appointing the president of the chief court. These are things cannot be separated from a political agenda, a survival technique, the aim of which is to destroy, and that's where we are right now. I'd like us to look at what's going to happen in a couple of months. The state prosecutor is going to retire, Shai Nitzan, and I say right here, Shai Nitzan's term should be extended until the completion of the hearing of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Enough of tainting this entire process. Just last week, we saw a targeted assassination of a tender for the acting state prosecutor only because Liat Ben-Ari was contending because she was involved in Netanyahu's case. There are threats to leading prosecutors, to judges, and if we don't understand that people will be afraid to do their jobs soon, then we won't be understanding the magnitude of the danger. What is democracy? Only that we can vote? Does that mean it's the state prosecutor knows the ins and outs of the Netanyahu case, and he should complete his term, even if it means extending it by a few months until the hearing is over. The Prime Minister is using all kinds of tricks in order to prevent an indictment from being served, the elections and new elections and again new elections. The whole process has been tainted. Professor Friedmann, how we could say that you moved with a little discomfort, as the cliche goes. This whole matter of blocking an appointment, it's important to understand what's happening here. I said that we have two executives. We also have two legislatures. Perhaps the audience hasn't heard these things before. We have to understand that many of the laws are passed by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in the context of its struggle with a certain justice minister, passed a law that has no basis in legislation, and he said that during a transition government you can't pass laws. But that's an invention of the Supreme Court, not the government, not the Knesset. It's an invention of whole cloth by the Supreme Court, and it's going to boomerang. Who invented that? And there's another thing. This whole matter of the procedures against the Prime Minister is a very big mess. Why? Because the Attorney General, who I think is in a very strong, intense conflict of interest, on the one hand he's dealing with the Prime Minister's case file, and I have a lot of reservations with how he's doing it, but there was an interview, and I would say it was a natural interview that was self-evident there was an idea to separate the roles of the Attorney General, who is the legal advisor to the government, and the prosecution. Who was against it? The legal system. So we don't have a situation of saints on one hand, angels on the one side, who are defending us from the bad children. There are entities here, each of which has its own interests, each of which has dictated its own line, and sometimes that line boomerangs, and now it's boomeranging. But the role of the Attorney General should be separated into two jobs, and that's the source of this whole problem. And the conflict of interest of the Attorney General, and that is something that the legal system has aspired and continues to strive to preserve. And that's the situation we're working in. And it's not the government that's at fault or the Knesset that's at fault. The government and the Knesset together were not strong enough to overcome the legal system and create that separation, which is crucial for everything that needs to be done here. Professor Friedmann, I'd like to open parenthesis, if I may. When you hear Yariv Levin and Yitshaki and Amir Ochana to Yogev saying that they are the people continuing your path, how do you feel about that? There are certain things that I agree with them on and things I don't agree with them on. You wasted your life in the law. You could have been an excellent diplomat. Okay, here's a new proposal. I have to say, nobody's ever said that to me before. It's nice to come here when you get such nice proposals. But listen, the fact that the Supreme Court expanded on its own laws that broaden its powers. Amir Ochana doesn't miss Zussman. I don't know who he misses or what he misses. He's not here. That's not the subject of the discussion. I'd like to remind you, the Supreme Court during Zussman would not have let Kahana be elected to the Knesset. It would not have allowed Bashara to be elected to the Knesset. Were we less democratic then? Who created this whole problem? We have to understand that the legal system is a governmental system. It has a lot of power, and you have to find the right balance between it and the legislature and the executive. And there's one more point I'd like to add. Just recently, we have heard about the huge number of arrests in Israel. And we have to understand that the greatest violation of human rights is criminal law and the huge number of arrests. Who's responsible for that? There is a struggle going on for many years between the Knesset and the legal system. The Knesset systematically champions the liberal approach and to reducing the number of arrests. The courts are just the opposite. Who is safeguarding human rights? You'll see that in the Knesset, that in this case, the Knesset is doing more for human rights than the legal system. There are areas in which I agree with Professor Friedmann, says Dori Klagsbald. And there are things I don't agree with. I don't agree with Professor Friedmann's approach regarding the court as a legislator. When the court says that during a transition period laws may not be or people cannot be appointed, or why is that different? That is, in 1953, the court said that an instruction that says that the Minister of the Interior has the authority to close a newspaper means that the Minister of Interior does not have the authority to close a newspaper. That's part of its job, to interpret the laws and so on. There's nothing new in that. And as a rule, I think that the courts in Israel are the weaker branch. On the one hand, the court does not benefit from a written constitution. The constitution we have is weak. Basic law, human dignity and freedom, which everyone is so afraid of, can be changed by a majority of two. And nothing has changed in the past 25 years. That law was passed 25 years ago. Since the Bank Mechazrachi ruling, 25 years have passed. But legitimacy of turning basic laws into a constitution. So I think that the Supreme Court starts from a lower starting point than the other branches. As MK Swid says, the politicians are the majority on the judge appointment panel. And to say that the court has become stronger and that it legislates like legislature, I don't think that's true. Superintendent Mizrahi, what's happening in the police? There hasn't been a police commissioner for quite a long time, and it apparently won't have a commissioner soon after quite a turbulent term by Ronnie Mizrahi. So many attacks upon it from the political system. When you put it in perspective, you're no longer in uniform, and you can look at it with the perspective of time and distance. If I may, I'd like to relate to what was said here about framing people and falsifying evidence against people. It's amazing. There is a long list of subjects that come up again and again, and we hear them from a particular side, which is usually connected to those who are harmed by those cases. It's true. There are cases that don't reach indictment, and I'm happy to say there are cases in which people are completely innocent. There is a very clear route to take, to say that from the inside it sounds like when you wake up in the morning, we have every year about 400,000 cases. They don't all involve, of course, public corruption. Most of them are serious crimes and so on. But to say that you wake up in the morning and you hold discussions in Jerusalem, in the Justice Ministry or whatever, and you think about how to mark a target and start work, I can tell you with 100% certainty during my 3+ years as the head and 2 more years as the head of LAV 433, no such thing existed, period. I say that with full responsibility. So I am a bit upset by hearing that those cases that were opened, and the audience can see, we don't start discussing them if we don't have cross information. If we get things, if it doesn't come, if it's not evidence that's not relevant is moved aside. Only if we get evidence from completely different directions, for example, from journalists, from events that happen, from a development in the case, from state witnesses who broadened the picture. These are cases that may be looked into. As I say, these are things that are examined on the level of the prosecution and the Attorney General and in the police, in our own by our own legal verse. There are very serious processes involved. And I believe that's how it will continue. That's our education, the education of the investigators and the investigating systems. You know, you can accuse, you can say it's a coincidence, but we see one justice minister and another justice minister. I can say that I would hope that those who follow me and those who follow them will never have to investigate a justice minister. I hope very much. I just like to tell the audience how things happen. I'm talking about pieces of information. You either confirm them or rebut them. But you're collecting things ahead of time. What do you mean ahead of time? The information comes in. It has to come in somewhere. You're saying it's a cone. If tomorrow the legal advisor of a ministry brings in information and tells what's happening in his ministry, you can't ignore it and stop your ears and not listen. You have to listen. And you can decide whether there's anything to it or not. I wanted to say something. I'm looking at the clock. So I'm ignoring the clock. The judiciary, this is by way of summation. I'd like to say something about the fact that the Supreme Court has cancelled too many laws of the Knesset. The Supreme Court of Israel Only 18 laws have ever been cancelled since 1992, and some ordinances. And if I were to ask the audience which laws have been cancelled other than the illegal immigrants law, no one will know. It's less than one per year. On the other hand, all the other courts all around the world, and there are a lot of comparative studies, cancel many more laws than our Supreme Court. In case Swid, we talked about interest, and Professor Friedmann talked about the interest of the court. Yes, the court and the Supreme Court have an interest. It's a public interest. The Supreme Court is the one that defends the rule of law in Israel. The Supreme Court protects the interests of the minorities and the weaker elements in the population. The question is if it isn't also defending its own power. Of course not. The only thing it does is to look at cases where there is harm done to the rule of law, and then the court intervenes. We say that in all the various laws passed by the last Knesset. Those are laws where the Attorney General and the legal advisor of the Knesset, and I was a member of the Constitutional Committee, and they said these are anti-constitutional laws. And when the Attorney General stands and tells the Knesset, you're about to pass a law that I cannot defend before the High Court of Justice, what is the High Court of Justice supposed to do? Clearly, they'll come afterwards and say that the Supreme Court cancels laws and abrogates laws and interferes too much and has too much power. The discourse that filters down to the public, it sounds like the Supreme Court and the High Court of Justice is the enemy of the people. And that must be stopped because it will take years for us to correct those mistakes when things are distorted from the legal mutations that are passed by the Knesset. Professor Friedmann, your last word. I think we had a democracy until the 1980s and the 1990s, and a good democracy at that. And the court occasionally intervened and did what it did and maybe canceled things, but it recognized the strength of the Knesset to override its ruling. At a certain stage, it decided that it no longer recognizes that right. As soon as it does not recognize that and is willing even to abrogate basic laws, it's almost unavoidable for the Knesset to respond. The very discussion of the very fact that a discussion regarding the evacuation of the Gaza Strip, that it came to the court, is a scandal. I think we so far have been very restrained and didn't interrupt one another, so I don't suggest we use this extension of time to start doing that. Superintendent Mizrahi, as I said earlier, it's very important that Israeli society understand that the things, the investigations that are happening, and that they support the gatekeepers and to trust the processes. I think the processes are very good, and we need that support. Thank you all.